Okay, so welcome everybody to another Heart Community Group conversation in our series Adapting for an Uncertain Future. And today we're delighted to welcome Nick Drew from Communities Prepared and all sorts of other organisations. I had a chat with Nick last week, and I know you're involved in lots of different things, Nick, so we look forward to hearing about that. Nick and I are going to have a brief conversation. I'm going to ask Nick to introduce himself and what he does. And then, as I say, there'll be a chance to ask questions later. If you think of a question as we're going along, you feel free to type it in the chat box, and we will come to you and ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, so huge welcome, Nick. Thank you so much for your time. You are still muted.
Yes, that's right, Kim. Thank you.
There you go. So can we start? I just ask you to introduce yourself, and I know you wear lots of different hats. So maybe just a quick run through of your roles and what you kind of what you do when you get up in the morning.
Yeah, that sounds like a good starting point, Kim. Although my backdrop is here about Communities Prepared, which is a project run by Groundwork, and I'll just briefly introduce that shortly. But just by way of a bit of context, as Kim says, I do get involved in various other things, and this is a picture that I shared with Kim. It's not quite up to date, but I'm trying to get it into focus for you. I've got to put it next to my face, haven't I? Okay, so that's not working on the camera. But basically what this shows is the things that I'm doing at different scales. So within my local community, I'm involved in a transition town group that I helped to set up. And then within my sort of local authority area, I'm involved in the climate change partnership there, and particularly on the adaptation subgroup, because that's something that I feel very passionately about, and something that often doesn't get as much traction as some of the other aspects of climate change around mitigation. Then within the sort of the city region area, in the Liverpool city region I live in, I was involved in coordinating the 2019 year of the environment, which brought me into contact with a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different perspectives. But I've also been involved with climate cafes in that particular area as well. I could talk a little bit more about that if people are interested. Across the Northwest, I've been involved in transition towns and trying to sort of join some of those up, which has been very interesting. They're all sort of grassroots, bottom-up organisations, so they've all quite different characteristics and different ways of operating. But I've also been involved in a past job working for the Local Energy Northwest Hub, which is sponsoring work around, at the time it was European funded money that I was involved in, but around local energy projects sort of on quite a large scale. But my day job now is Communities Prepared, and I do that for 2.5 days a week. But I'm also involved at a sort of UK-wide level with an organisation called the Climate Psychology Alliance, and I'm particularly interested in that as a key part of our response to the climate crisis, and I think that chimes quite well with some of the things that I've seen from your Heart group as well. So quite a sort of broad backdrop of things, and I'm sure that we can touch on some or maybe not all of those, but during our time together. But I think what's probably the reason that Kim got in touch with Communities Prepared was really to sort of understand a little bit more about Communities Prepared. So probably a good place for me to start is to just give a bit of background to that. And you can see I've got my logo there by Groundwork, and I don't know how many of you have come across Groundwork, but it's a charity with a sort of environmental and social background, looking at empowering communities, often in areas of quite strong need, where the ethos is really around giving the communities the tools and helping them to take action. And it's something that started about 40 years ago, not far away from where I am, actually, up in the Northwest, in the sort of Knowsley and St Helens area, and it's grown from that sort of initial start into a federated organisation. So there are different groundwork trusts for sort of Wales and Northern Ireland and London, and I'm actually affiliated with the Groundwork South bit of Groundwork, but it's a sort of national scale organisation. And about sort of 2017, there was a Pathfinder project that Groundwork set off, which was looking at flooding in Cornwall. And we worked with the Cornwall Community Flood Forum and Cornwall College around creating some resources. I've got some examples of resources. I don't know how well this will work given my last attempt to share something on the screen, but little handbooks about things like utility volunteer training or community emergency volunteer coordinator training, flood volunteer training, snow volunteer training. You get the impression, the sort of things that it's covering. And from those initial starting points down in Devon and Cornwall, down in the southwest, it's grown, and especially with COVID, where there was suddenly a move to have lots of people doing exactly this, talking over Zoom. We've been able to deliver training remotely. And that's meant that we've been able to sort of reach a much broader part of England through the programme. It's been funded by the National Lottery for pretty much all of its existence, but with other funders being involved as well for sort of particular aspects of what we've been doing. And it's kind of a programme that feels, from a Groundwork perspective, really important, I think, as people have, over that time, if you think back to sort of 2017, we hadn't had Extinction Rebellion and school strikes and all of those things. It was very difficult to get people to actually sort of engage with climate change as a topic. I think things have changed quite a lot over that period. But as I mentioned before, adaptation is still sort of the poor relation. And so I think in areas where communities have actually been impacted with some of these kind of floods, or we had the significant power outages from Storm Arwen last year, which took out a lot of electricity for people in the northeast for a long period of time. I think people are starting to acknowledge that they do need to think about how to get ready for some of the things that we're coming across in the future. And so communities prepared is really a way to help you to sort of organise your community. And the start point for this is sometimes it's particular members of the community who sort of say, we want to do something, we want to set up a group locally to prepare for some of the vulnerabilities and risks that we know we're facing. Sometimes it's the local authority, the local council, that will get in touch with us. The Environment Agency, who we work closely with, will sometimes point us towards particular communities that say they see as being at risk of flood or other environmental issues. And we have been working, as you touched on briefly, with some local resilience forums as well, trying to work with them about how to engage communities. And I think, and just for the purpose of, before we get into the question, but I want to almost put away my takeaway messages at the start in case people don't get through to the end of the video. But the really important things for me about organising your community, so getting them to that space, whether it's through Communities Prepared or some other way, but just building those links both within and beyond your community of people that you might need to call on in times of emergency. So building your knowledge, building your skills, exercising it, and sort of keep iterating around that process. So that feels like one really important thing about how to organise your community. Another one is actually, it's about time. And for me, there's a sense of we've got quite sort of limited time to prepare ourselves as a nation, as the UK, for some of the disruption that we're starting to see now, but is going to just get worse. So at the moment we've got the ability to do these kind of things and to do this training and to prepare before some of these impacts start to hit. So my message is really sort of don't put it off, but just get on with actually taking action, because there is, and I've noticed this in my own journey around climate change, you become aware of these things, But then there's a lag before you actually sort of think, right, this is sufficiently important that I now have to take action. And the quicker that we can sort of get from that awareness to action space, you know, the more benefit we'll have in terms of community readiness. And the last point that I had in my sort of takeaways was really about just keep talking about it, and creating safe spaces so that we can listen to each other, because I think that's very important as well. You know, it's this sort of sense of being kind around this, and I can see, you know, that sort of chimes with the ethos of Heart as well. So I sort of feel that hopefully we're on the same page with some of this. Yeah. I don't know if you'd like me to say any more particularly at the moment, Kim. I was happy to talk a little bit about my own sort of journey on climate change and how I'd got to this point.
I'd love you to, perhaps a bit later on. In fact, we've got a couple of questions that are around that, but thank you very much. That was excellent. And I love your three takeaways. So, you know, community organising, don't hang about, and keep talking with kindness. Brilliant. Yeah, right up our street, very well aligned. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the range of risks that, you know, are considered by the organisations that you're involved with. We've just been sent a very recent report by the Schumacher Institute that came out just last month now, February. Which I've put the link to the full report in the chat there. But if we kind of just look at so they came up with, you know, 8 risks that we should be aware of, and also an additional 4 that I think go far beyond the kind of, you know, what we typically talk about, which is flooding and maybe heat waves and that sort of thing. You know, they include food and water insecurity, systems failure, extreme weather, of course, pollution, biodiversity loss, health and well-being, including mental health, social and political unrest, and the rising inequality in our society, pandemics, future pandemics, energy, and of course, climate refugees. And I know, you know, there's a whole load of stuff in there, and I don't expect you to talk about all those in detail, but I'm just interested in, yeah, I mean, to what extent is your sense that people are looking across all of those, or are we kind of cherry picking just a few?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kim. And there's a sense, and I can answer this from a personal perspective, or a sort of organisational perspective, and I think, you know, I've been involved with, I've had several workshops, in fact, with the Schumacher Institute over about 5 or 6 years ago, looking at this sort of preparing for the future type work that they were doing at the time. And part of what feels really important in this is actually about the time horizon that people are prepared to look at. I think in what I've seen of, you know, the National Risk Register, which is the sort of the government level risk register, some of those things that you've listed are present, but not all of them, I believe. So, and this is partly down to, you know, whether there's a function within government, a sort of a clear government department that can do the thinking around some of these things, or whether it's something that sort of falls in between the gaps a little bit. But I certainly feel, from my own perspective, that we need to take a much longer term view about some of the risks that are facing us. And it's quite difficult, I think, with the sort of the political cycles and the sort of the way that our society is sort of set up, really is looking sort of increasingly short term. So I think there's a there's a mismatch there, and to some extent think tanks like the Schumacher Institute are really important in sort of raising, you know, that awareness of these longer term, much bigger issues that we're facing. And from a communities prepared perspective, you know, we're sort of in the kind of more of the extreme weather event space, because of a lot of our background, as I said, was initially around flooding. You know, we're moving towards sort of more on droughts and heat waves and wildfires as well. But some of those other issues that you've mentioned around sort of migration, you know, food security and so on, aren't necessarily spaces that communities prepared is currently active in. Groundwork to some extent are doing bits and pieces around sort of food security and food growing projects, but not necessarily as a sort of a systemic level response to an identified risk.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's, you know, that's part of the challenge, isn't it? It's all of these things are interconnected, but there's hardly anybody looking at the big picture. I think, you know, they kind of focus in their little niches, and I think we might have a debate, you and I, about what's long term and what's short term. But yeah, no, thank you for that. And it's good to see people are in a range of different organisations looking at this stuff. Chantal, do you want to ask your question about the non-negotiable one thing for communities?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, to help sort of focus people's minds a bit. And it might be a bit of a difficult question for you to answer, Nick, but if there was one thing that you feel that local communities should be focusing on in terms of preparedness, that you feel is absolutely non-negotiable, what would it be?
I think it really depends on where the community already is to some extent, and I think this is partly down to people's acceptance of the situation that they're in. I think from, you know, some of the work I've done with different transition towns, you know, there's always this sort of sense of, well, we're the people who sort of are worried about the future and want to make ourselves more resilient and build those community linkages. But there's a lot of people within the community who just don't see the need for that. So there's always this sort of sense of how do you get the message across. And I think, you know, as I touched on before, that's changed over the last sort of 3 or 4 years as people are starting to wake up to some of this stuff. But it still feels quite difficult to sort of give a sort of boilerplate answer that says, right, for every community, this is what you need to do. I think you've got to understand where they currently are and what sort of the next step is. If you've got the sort of the 4-column model, if everybody's over sort of on the left-hand side and not thinking there's too much of a problem, you've got to sort of get them to the point where they acknowledge there's a sufficient problem, they've got to take action. So I think for me, a lot of it is really around, as I touched on before, this sort of keep talking about it and creating those safe spaces to listen. And I think that when you've got that sort of sufficient people that are in the space that yourselves are in, then I think it's time to move into that sort of taking action piece, which is actually then looking at the risks that you face as a community. Yeah. And so there are certainly at the local resilience forum level, there are community risk registers. I think each local resilience forum has to produce a risk register based on the national risk register, but that is specific to the risks within their particular area of the country.
So it sounds like that, sorry to interrupt you, sounds like that actually then is probably one of the non-negotiables, is actually, because if you don't understand the level of risk, then it's hard to know what you need to prioritise in terms of adaptation and resilience on a practical level. Yeah.
That's true. I think the other difficulty, and we just touched on this in the previous discussion, the previous question, was around whether those risks are comprehensive and sort of, you know, long term and looking at all the things that might happen. So you would get from the local resilience forum a particular view of risk, which might not be the same as you'd have got from the Schumacher Institute report, for example. So there's a degree of understanding what you feel is the the right focus for your particular community. And I think this is where it's a mixture of understanding the risks, but also what the appetite is amongst the people in the community to do something about them. Because there's no point in everybody worrying about food security if nobody actually wants to sort out, their food systems. And this is where the transition network or transition towns have sort of got this quite diverse approach, because it's partly down to the local need, but partly down to the interests and passions and skills of the people within that community as to what response is actually taken. That's a bit of a long answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful, and I think that's something we've been looking at here, sort of hyper locally, with Kate and some other people. So starting to think about risks and looking at buildings and, so I think that's starting to build here a bit. But no, that makes sense. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chantal. Thanks, Nick. And Ros has just put in the chat that link doesn't work. It's weird because it does for me. You have to go to that page and then click on another thing. So maybe try it again. Otherwise, I will send it round after this call to everybody who's here. Kate, do you want to unmute yourself and ask about public services being overwhelmed and specifically heat waves?
Yeah, can I ask 2 questions actually?
Yeah, sure.
One from Chantal, and Ross has also got in the chat here about how do we see local risk registers, which is all kind of involved, but just following on from, finding a group of people. I'll put my video back on. Finding a group of people locally to start sort of spreading this. In your experience, if say a group of us wanted to do one of your courses, for instance, what's sort of a good size of a group to make it worthwhile to do? If there's only a couple of us, I guess that's not going to be working. So have you got sort of an idea on how many people we need to pull into this project? Yeah,
and I probably didn't give enough background, Kate, on the kind of offer that we actually do, which is a mixture of we do some in-person workshops and courses. A lot of it is online though, which means that you can sort of attend remotely, and depending on how many people there are from your particular area, that we could sort of potentially try and put a little bit more of a focus on your particular area. But that's not to say that you couldn't attend a workshop from Communities Prepared with people from across the country more widely. Sure. And what we tend to do is to sort of have a sort of introductory session where people can come along and say hello and explain what they're looking to do, and to sort of do a little bit of, not exactly networking, but to try and sort of just explain their context, and for us to try and work with yourselves to sort of work out what might be the right route for you and the right sort of offer for you. I think in terms of numbers, it feels that about sort of, I don't know, eight people or so is sort of a good sort of minimum number to try and run a course. Obviously, I think when we were all locked down, there was a bit more attendance at some of these sort of online things, but I think everybody got a little bit burnt out, and so you'll sometimes get people that would like to come along but then discover that the real world takes over and they can't always make it. So I think that in terms of capacity and how many people you need in a group, it does feel in my experience that you need sort of 5 to 8 people who are actually going to sort of to take action. And I think there's then a sort of a wider set of people who are interested and would like to be supportive, but don't actually have, the time or the wherewithal. And I think a key part of this is actually about leadership as well within communities, and who's willing to sort of to set these things up. And obviously, within Hertfordshire, you've organised yourselves to set up the Heart Group, and I think that's really important. That if there were more of those kind of groups around the country, I think that would be, you know, an excellent thing to help boost resilience.
Mm.
Great, yeah, thank you. May I ask the other question, which is sort of where we are in sort of southeast Hertfordshire, in our particular area, we're not kind of going to be having coastal flooding, or even where the exact place where we live is not going to be river flooding either. But obviously there's other risks, there's pluvial, like just downpours and stuff. But I think at the moment I'm really focusing on heat waves for some reason, with El Nino coming possibly next year. And obviously what we had last year, that just feels quite pertinent, one, because it's needed resilience to that, and also as a good way to engage the local population of what we can do and everything. So and obviously we our local county council has recently done a whole day on adaptation, and they've updated their heat plan and all those kind of things. But really I'd kind of like to understand, you know, really at what point do public services become overwhelmed in a heat wave, and when, you know, the local people are going to be needed to get vulnerable people to air-conditioned spaces, those kind of things. Is that a likely scenario anytime soon, or, you know, is that modelling being done anywhere? Do you know?
I think that's something that's going to vary across the country, I think, Kate. So I wouldn't be able to say for your particular area what's been done and what hasn't. I'm conscious that where I live, you know, I mentioned that I've been involved in the adaptation group of the Climate Change Partnership, and part of this, from our perspective, has been trying to understand what the risks are that are out there. Certainly talking with social housing providers and thinking about schools and you know, other sort of public buildings, and what the adaptation might be needed, what to the sort of the operating range of temperatures that you can expect to use a building for. I think that's work that, you know, it only really feels that it was last summer that people sort of started to wake up to, oh, global warming and heat waves, and what does this actually mean in terms of what we will be facing in the future, and starting to think a little bit more about adaptation. And at the moment, and I could be misinformed here, but it feels that the sort of general government guidance from you know, the sort of what was Public Health England, but it's now the sort of the I forget the acronym now, but the people that will look after those sort of general messages around how to protect your health in terms of a heat wave. Things like not going out in the middle of the day and drinking plenty of water, and sort of general messages along the sort of personal what you can do. When it comes to responses in terms of infrastructure and specifically buildings, you know, I don't think that we've yet grappled with what this means for our things like our housing stock. You know, from a just a carbon emissions perspective, thinking about the amount of retrofitting that we would need to do to reduce our carbon emissions is quite significant. To some extent, you know, that could help or hinder in the heat wave, depending on what kind of solutions are put in place. So there's definitely some work to look at this from sort of local authority level, and understand what the risks are, and what might need to be done in terms of responses. You know, we're talking about warm spaces at the moment with you know, the cost of living crisis, but there might be a need for cool spaces in heat wave conditions as well.
Yeah, exactly. We're starting to think about that. I mean, you know, the public health people are saying to us, you know, we have a plan. All vulnerable people will be moved to cool spaces and it'll all be fine. But I'm just kind of at some point, that's surely going to be failing. You know, if we're having an extended heat wave, or it's very hot. So yeah, things to consider. Really.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in hot countries, you know, the buildings are designed differently, with sort of cool overhanging courtyards and things like that. You know, different kinds of planting of trees to keep the area cool and other things. And I think that we've yet to sort of properly get our heads around as a nation, some of the adaptation measures we would need to put in place, because I think it's happening, faster than people were expecting to some extent.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And judging by, well, just going back to food insecurity, I understand the part of it again is this non-joined up phenomenon. I think is it Mark Spencer, the minister responsible for food security, doesn't seem to be interested in either defining what it is or measuring it or taking any kind of interventionist action at all. And there's so many different government departments involved. And I think I'm right in saying still that even the government's own National Adaptation Committee rates us as something like a 3 or a 4 out of 10. And I think that's on the high side in terms of readiness. And so, yeah, it's not looking good. But yeah, we're sort of almost do what we can. Thank you. So again, lovely people, do type your questions in, or I'm going to open it up in a few minutes. I was just interested, on a more personal level, Nick, couple of things. What supports you in remaining so, emotionally and psychologically resilient in the face of all of this? And what's been your kind of journey as far as that's concerned? And then perhaps this is overcomplicating the question, but what do you personally recommend? What are you doing personally to adapt to what's probably going to be a very different future?
So in terms of my own journey, I think I've been on a bit of a sort of a personal path, which I think mirrors some of the things that other people might have done. So to start off with, I wasn't really properly aware of these things at all, although I found an old GCSE geography folder a year or so ago, which had got this thing that sort of touched on global warming as being a threat for the future, and I sort of dug it out because it was still in the back of my mind. But really, it was only about 8 or 9 years ago that I sort of thought, well, I need to do something here, and I sort of changed my job and got involved in climate change things. And back then, I was sort of in the space of I've got these different books that sort of illustrate these steps on the way, but this sort of You Can Save the Planet, which was about day in the life of your carbon footprint, and that sort of sense of what you can do personally, through to sort of thinking about more system level change, and that's things like Zero Carbon Britain, which we are rethinking the future. So what are the changes that we need to make that will allow us to carry on with the kind of, not exactly the same lifestyles we've got, but certainly a sort of within the context of trying to stop the climate change, through to a sort of wider thinking beyond the sort of current economic model, and sort of, well, how can we imagine how we might live in the future? And that was in the sort of transition town space, which from what is to what if. And then I think around about 2018, I think it was when Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper came out, that I sort of, a mixture of my sort of optimism around how quickly things might happen, and the sort of the realism, I think, of what Jem had written, brought me into this sort of space where I'm now in the sort of this civilization is finished space now. So I've sort of moved over time along a bit of a continuum.
Very similar.
Yeah. And I think that everybody's sort of got to go through some sort of journey in this space. And what that leaves me with is a whole set of emotions and a whole set of things around letting go and grief around, a future that I'd imagined, the sort of the stories that we're brought up around sort of growth as being, a good thing, and progress will always sort of carry on moving forward, to a point where you start to question some of those assumptions. And I think, I've come to the conclusion, that this isn't a problem that we can solve, whether it's a wicked problem or any other kind of problem. It's actually a predicament that we are now in, and we've got to work out how to live with that, and work out what the right thing is to do in with the time that we've got, and that's a difficult thing to to keep coming back to, and something that I've had on my windowsill is this book, which they keep flashing in and out, don't they? What If We Stop Pretending, by Jonathan Franzen. And just it's sort of there as a reminder for me to keep coming back to this sort of, we're in a particularly difficult predicament. We do need to sort of keep coming back around to it. In terms of what keeps me resilient, I think there's a mixture of things. Personally, there's being in nature. I think that's really important. I sort of see, especially for me, being near the sea is quite an important thing, or in woodlands and things like that. I think another thing that's really important is being with people who have gone on a similar journey and can relate to some of the emotions that you're talking about. I feel very fortunate to be part of the Climate Psychology Alliance, and I feel there's a lot of like-minded people in that space that I've spent time talking to and being in workshops with, and sort of looking at responses at a sort of more societal level rather than just the individual as well. So I've found that's been really helpful, but also changing what I do. And I mentioned, I sort of changed my job, and as I've gone through that progression of sort of thinking, let's try and fix this climate crisis, to a sort of, we've got to live with it, and it's more of a predicament. That sort of sense of, well, what roles am I particularly interested in doing? And that's why I ended up applying for a job with Communities Prepared, because I thought, well, there's a lot of people now who sort of have got the message of we've got to reduce our carbon emissions, but there's very few organisations and a few people that seem to be working proactively in adaptation, and specifically in adaptation in terms of community responses. And that, to me, is the key thing. I think, yes, you can build lots of infrastructure, whether they're seed walls or flood defences or whatever, but actually it's the people is where the impacts will be most felt. And that felt like that was why I decided that I wanted to get involved with Communities Prepared, to help to just sort of do whatever we can to to give communities that best chance to respond to some of the things that we know are coming their way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is a really difficult journey, challenging journey, and but a very meaningful one, I think. And yeah, the predicament, I call it the meta crisis, or actually in the last few days somebody introduced me to another term which I love, omni-shambles. I love that, omni-shambles. Yeah, so no, that's really interesting, and I think there is great nourishment, as you've discovered, in really kind of asking ourselves, rather than just staying in fear or worry or grief, although those are all incredibly understandable emotions, to actually move into agency in some way. And you're a kindred spirit, Nick.
Thank you.
So yeah, let me open it up. Who else has got a question for Nick? Yeah, Nikki.
Hi, I was just about to start typing and I thought I might as well just put my hand up. Hi, Nick, thank you. I was just interested, when you start outreach in a community, how do you prioritise this at the moment while there's so many things that, you know, ordinary people, full-time job, you know, children to look after, worrying about money, heating, all those things that are being prioritised in our mainstream media. How do we shift that priority and put it into perspective when you're talking about being prepared for, you know, the real, what I would class as the real risks? I don't know if you've got anything you could say about that.
I have. One of the things that we've been looking to do is to build a sort of stronger network of people who can start to sort of put that message out there and work with communities to sort of build that awareness and appetite's not quite the right word, but, you know, to sort of that need that there is for doing this kind of preparedness work within communities, because, as you say, there's a lot of people whose focus is very much elsewhere. They're on the day-to-day aspects of their lives. You know, we've all got other things going on, so looking into the sort of the longer term and thinking about global problems is you know, just too large a stretch for a number of people. And I think you're right, the mainstream media does feel that they don't focus on this significantly. I think when we had COP26 in Glasgow, I think at that point the amount of media coverage got bigger, and there was then a sort of a you know, it rose up the priority issues of the population to say, yes, this climate change thing is important. I suspect if you did that survey again now, I think they do it all the time, don't they? But looking at it, I suspect that the environment would have dropped down a little bit, you know, because the media focus has moved elsewhere. But I think in terms of engaging with communities, I think it's the sort of thing that you're doing as HEART actually is the right things to be doing. I don't know what your perception as a group is about, you know, how your messages are landing more widely across Hertfordshire, and, you know, do you get a sense that there's a sort of a growing awareness and a growing interest and a sense of we need to do something, and that sort of agency aspect? You know, I'm interested to learn from yourselves as well, but it's certainly something that we in Communities Prepared have said we'd really like to have the capacity and to be funded to do more of this sort of you know, outreach, awareness, networking kind of thing, which is the sort of work that I believe that you're doing at the moment.
Thank you, Nikki. And Ros asks, how can we see our local risk register? What would we put in Google or Ecosia or whatever we use?
I'm just thinking it ought to be on your local resilience forum, ought to have published it, and if not that, then some local authority. I can take it away and find out, but I think that they ought to have all been published. Failing that, then certainly the National Risk Register is available. If you just Google the National Risk Register, then you'll get that, and that's kind of what the local risk registers are often a sort of subset of that, so that they will you know, focus in, as I said before, on the specific risks that are relevant to that part of the world.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Just got time for a couple more questions. Who's got one?
I've got one.
Go for it.
I've got another one. Yeah, talking of resilience forums, so we are trying to get in touch with them. In your sort of experience, do they kind of welcome community groups trying to engage with them and to help spread the message, or is it something? Do they kind of perceive us as meddling people and just want to get on with it?
I can't give you a direct answer to that, Kate, because they're all different, and this is one of these interesting things about the setup of these resilience forums. So there's a principle called subsidiarity, which is about, the local area knows best about, what's needed in their area. So somebody from above shouldn't be telling them this is how you need to set yourselves up. So although they've been created, in law as a a body that needs to exist, there hasn't been any rigid direction about precisely how they should operate. There's been some standards which talk about these are some of the things that are good practice, and some of the things that you are required to do as a local resilience forum, and some of the things that you might want to consider doing. But the way that they've each implemented that is different. So off the top of my head, I can't say yes. Your local resilience forum is desperate to have community groups coming and talking to it. What often happens is there's an organisation that will act as the sort of the entry point for a number of community organisations, whether that's the sort of the local CVS organisation, community and voluntary sector, or sometimes it might be the Red Cross or some other organisation that's sort of got a number of different links into different community groups. But at the moment, there's been no sort of consistent approach to this, as far as I can see. But the local resilience forums have been given some more responsibilities over the last few years since they were originally set up. Basically, more things are sort of falling towards them as a logical point where this stuff should be coordinated. As a result of that, the government, I think, are giving them more money to get more capacity within the forums, so that they're able to sort of better coordinate this sort of wider view. And something that's come out just before Christmas was the UK government resilience framework. And sorry, I'm once again trying to get this to show up, but there we are. And this is really sort of starting this recognition that the UK would like to be the most resilient nation. We have lofty ambitions in these things, but there's a set of things that need to happen to sort of understand how the whole of society would respond to this. And it's partly a recognition in terms of some of the challenges that we face, with climate change, with Brexit, with the security world as it's existing at the moment, and a much more interconnected world, so that issues that can happen abroad can have a direct impact on the UK. So the government have sort of acknowledged this and trying to get the whole of society to work together, but within this context, as I mentioned before, of not trying to direct everything that's happening. So you've sort of got to coordinate rather than dictate, which is quite resource intensive, because you end up having to have lots of conversations. So it does feel that things are moving forward, both in terms of the way that the local resilience forums operate, but also the sort of the ecosystem that they live within as well, and how the community groups can play a part in that. Feels like that the time is good for community groups to contact the local resilience forum and say, how can we play a part in what you're doing?
Thanks. Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you. And thank you, Chantal, for adding that link there to that. So, Michael, you had a question, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, it was just to ask what your thoughts would be or are on these proposed 15-minute cities. We've heard quite a lot about a proposal in Oxford. I wonder what you thought about that.
I've not been following it too closely, Michael, to be honest. I'm aware of the idea of 15-minute cities from, I think, from Paris from a few years back, but I've not known quite what the debate's been in Oxford about the pros and cons, other than there seemed to be something about creating almost different zones, which sort of felt that they were potentially sort of stopping the flow of things that were happening today. So that's kind of as far as I know, but my feeling is more generally that localization is kind of an important aspect of how we respond to the climate crisis, and especially some of the breakdown of certain bits of infrastructure and things like that. It feels important that you can survive in a, I mean, we've talked about food security, but this sort of sense of how does your community localize its sort of sources of supplies, whether that's food or energy or whatever else. So that sort of idea of localization, I think, is really important. In terms of a 15-minute city, I don't know if that's sort of really thought all that stuff through, whether it's kind of just an easy way to say, from almost a transport perspective, if you can get to anywhere you want to within 15 minutes, then hopefully that will mean that you're not using the car or public transport, whatever, to the same extent.
Thank you. We had a conversation which is on the YouTube channel with the Town and Country Planning Association recently, so you can find that, which, if you're not familiar, explains the whole concept. And yes, you're right, Michael, there has been a backlash. There's been lots of conspiracy theories, actually, that it's a kind of secret plot to keep us all in our homes and control us. Yeah, so it's really interesting the way even with that, which is fundamentally, I think, in principle, a really great idea, it gets polarized so quickly. Yeah, thank you, Michael. One more if it's there. Yeah, Nikki.
I know I've had a turn, but sort of combining those two thoughts, really. As you said, you've worked through COVID in this capacity, where you were very prescribed, and there were laws, and there was, top-down guidance and things like that. Thinking about what Kate was saying as well, at what point do you think we need a bit of dictatorial stuff? At some point, if we were on the war footing or something, it would come out, we have to do this. This is, for our survival, we have to do it. When you were working with the COVID rules, was it easier to sort of encourage or maybe even insist that things were done than now? We've got the backlash of the conspiratorial worries of, oh, they're telling us what to do. Is it going to be harder now? I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think that's a really, really big and interesting question, Nikki. I'm not sure that I've got too much to offer on that. I think you could argue that if we'd have had a sort of more dictatorial approach back in whenever it was that James Hansen testified to Congress in the sort of late 80s, that we might not be in the situation we're in now, but that's kind of where we are. I suspect at some point, there will be situations where, for the wider safety of the population, that there might be, more directive approaches put in place. But I think, I don't have a crystal ball that says quite how this picture is going to unfold. All I sort of know, I suspect, is similar to yourselves, that things don't look too good at the moment.
I just wondered if, when you were dealing with COVID and there were strict government rules, whether people responded a bit more positively to that, or.
Yeah, I think what happened with COVID, and I wasn't actually delivering communities prepared training at that point, but I I think that there was a wider sort of upsurge more generally in the voluntary sector of people who came forward and wanted to be involved in supporting their community. And there was a much wider sense of, you know, we were all in the same boat with this thing. You know, there was it was affecting everybody equally. Okay, some people had much more difficult things to deal with, but it wasn't sort of, COVID wasn't discriminating. You know, we were all equally exposed to the risks. But I think in terms of getting more sort of response because of the rules that were set in around COVID and the restrictions that we were all having to live under, I don't feel that really impacted on what we were doing, beyond the fact obviously that we had to stop doing in-person events and had to start doing things over Zoom. And I think everybody sort of adapted around the same time, you know, collectively to this, oh, I'm no longer going to go to work in an office, I'm now going to work from home, or I'm no longer going to take the kids to school, I've got to teach them from the kitchen table, all these other things that happened. And so it did feel that we were all in sort of crisis response mode together, which felt really quite unusual to have something that happened to the whole country at the same time. I think there's a lot of lessons that have come out of that for resilience and for community working. I don't know that people have thought about it in terms, I'm sure the government have, in terms of what this means for how much control you might want to put around you know, the way in which people work in order to achieve certain outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. One last quick question, Nick, and it's a really unfair to ask you this, but have a go. If you were a magic wand, you're Prime Minister, okay, the Right Honourable Nick Drew, what's the one thing you would do immediately in terms of priorities?
I think that is quite a difficult question. I haven't prepared my manifesto yet, but I think there has to be more of a national conversation about where we're at and what we're facing, and I don't know quite how that would happen, but I think that this sort of awareness of the risks, and this is something that this government resilience framework does talk about. It's one of the sort of the first points in it is around, we've got to get our society better aware of risk, and then they perhaps, you know, this is a personal thing rather than what the document is saying, perhaps then there will be more of a culture of people responding to risk in their own personal capacity rather than assuming, you know, somebody else will sort it out for us. And I think that to me is the sort of the thing that I would suggest, that we've got to get to, as I said before, what if we stop pretending? We've got to sort of face this thing head on and really start to decide what we're going to do about it properly.
And as Rog says in the chat, tell the truth. Yeah. Nick, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and look forward to staying connected with you and having further conversations. Thank you everybody for coming. And I've just put in the chat, you might be interested, if you haven't seen them yet, some more upcoming conversations there on our website that you can register for. We've got some really interesting stuff coming up. But for now, thank you so much, everybody, and keep in touch and keep on keeping on. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.